So Heath, when we pick up the Bible and we read through the Old Testament in particular, we find a lot of different things, but one of the things that stands out to us throughout the history of Israel is that there's constantly war between God's people and some other foreign nation. And what's really interesting about that, or maybe problematic,
Right.
is that as we read those stories about war, we find that it's oftentimes God himself that seems to be commanding the death of thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And in our context today, there's a lot of people that will call themselves the new atheists, and they see this, as do I think most people when it strikes them, as being extremely problematic, that the God of Christianity, which we see to be sort of the foundation of our morality, is commanding such horrible, horrible things. So how do we think about that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yes, it is a very serious issue because, as you rightly say, the God that we worship is the God of the Old Testament, right? Who reveals himself preeminently in Jesus Christ. So this is a very difficult issue, especially considering the fact that many today will read the commands against nations in warfare that God gives in the Old Testament as a form of holy war. And holy war in today's vocabulary, it sounds a whole lot like jihad. So it's a very difficult question, because then you ask, is God commanding something like jihad in the Old Testament? And as Christians, how do we deal with that?
Yeah.
So it's a very difficult question, and I think it's a good question to explore. The first thing that I would say is, when you look at the Old Testament evidence, holy war is not a good definition for what we see in the Old Testament when we hear that God commands warfare. Holy war was coined and applied to the Old Testament, was coined by a German scholar named Friedrich Schwally in the early 20th century. And interestingly enough, do you know what he was comparing biblical war to? He was comparing it to Islamic jihad. And so it's interesting that he used that terminology and applied it to the Old Testament. What scholars have recently shown, however, is that's really not what's going on in the Old Testament. You don't have holy warriors fighting on behalf of God in the Old Testament. What you have is God commanding warfare, and it's God fighting on behalf of his people. A classic example of this would be, for instance, God fighting on behalf of his people against the Egyptians who oppress Israel in the book of Exodus. And in that context, a lot of scholars will say that you get God fighting on behalf of his people, which we would call holy war, where God, yes, commands warfare, but it's God who fights. In fact, in the Old Testament, in that context, the idea is, don't do anything. God will fight for you. Just be still and rest in God's protection.
So, okay, but what about then, though, the death of, say, women and children, babies, donkeys, chickens? I mean, the commands come in the form of wipe out everything and everybody. So is that necessary?
Yeah, and the question is really, isn't it, does God command genocide? Because that's the charge that's often been laid. Does God command genocide? Or maybe God does command genocide, it seems like. Right. And you find these commands in Deuteronomy and Joshua and Samuel. So you do find these. And the language of it is harem, utterly put to destruction or put to the ban certain people groups. And it sounds like God is a maniacal, genocidal maniac, you know, this crazy God. But actually, if we latch onto that language of utterly devote to destruction, the harem commands that you find in Deuteronomy, Joshua, and for instance, Samuel, you also neglect the more prevalent commands, which are to drive out or dispossess. So why these two commands? Why drive out and dispossess, and then utterly devote to destruction, men, women, etc.? Well, why these two commands? Well, because God really isn't interested in warfare. He's not bloodthirsty. He doesn't want the death of men, women, and children. He doesn't like the death of his creation, whether it's inanimate or animate objects. He doesn't like any of that. But what you do find, actually, is the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is written in a polytheistic culture. And in that culture, what you do find is there's this inseparable connection between a deity, like Israel's God, the land in which they live, and the people who live there. So God, land, people, there's this really close relationship between these. So in the ancient world, how do you show that the God that you worship is utterly false? It's empty. It's not worthy of worship. How do you do that? Well, actually, a simple sermon won't do. The reason for that is because the only way to show a deity as false is to defeat it in battle. You remember how I said God fights for his people in the Old Testament?
Right.
So people will call this Yahweh war or divine warfare. The same holds true for other nations. Their God goes to battle against Israel's God. And so when that happens, the way that you show that God to be false is you either go in and invade the land, so you dispossess the people from their land.
Sure.
You drive them out of their land, and it shows their God isn't protecting them. Or in warfare, obviously what happens is death and killing. So what you find in those two commands, drive out, dispossess, and utterly devote to destruction, you find two commands that, on the one hand, drive out and dispossess, remove the people from their land, or to utterly devote to destruction, for all practical purposes, release the people from their land through death. And it shows their God to be false. The two commands actually reveal that what God wants is worshipers. That's what he wants. He wants people to worship him, not other gods. The dispossession of the Canaanites, for instance, from their land would reveal their God to be false. And the actual utterly devote to destruction command is a little bit different, because one of the things that we find in the Old Testament is if people will worship Israel's God, the true God of it, of all things, of true God of creation, what you find is God will receive those people. Classic example would be Rahab. Rahab says, I want to be on your team because your God is greater than our God. And what happens is she's spared. Presumably that would have happened to the Canaanites as well, the people, who the command was given to. So it's not exactly fair to say that God commands genocide. That's like saying that we're all on the same level playing field. It's not the same. They're a polytheistic culture, we're not. He doesn't just command genocide, he's actually getting at worship. The command is often counterbalanced by another command. So what can we say about this? Well, there is a sense in which these commands are hyperbolic. They're saying something beyond just utterly, or else there's an inconsistency with the two commands.
Hence why these same people might show up again in a couple chapters.
Yes, that's right.
In a different place. They've
That's
been
right.
driven out.
Yeah. So that's what I would say.